Hi everyone, thanks for coming to check out the presentation of my own personal data story. For this, I went and collected 3 years of my own Garmin metrics to perform analysis on. The metrics that I pulled from my last 3 years of Garmin data off the Garmin Connect app were my calories, my sleep, my resting heart rate information, and my steps. From this point, I was also able to generate additional metrics, such as binary columns for whether it was a weekend or weekday, or whether or not I was attending university or I was just working. With all this information collected, my goal was to answer the following 5 questions that I see here, which were: what were my sleep and resting heart rate changes over the last 3 years? What are the differences for every day of the week? Is there a difference between my weekends and weekdays? Is there a difference in my metrics while I attended university versus while I was working? And finally, can I build a predictive model when looking at my data to look at certain attributes? Jumping over to my data story, I just wanted to touch on the data retrieval and wrangling steps. So from the Connect app, when downloading data, it comes in the form of CSV files. From there, I use Python to combine the CSV files, and then for the additional column generation and manipulation, I also used Python. Ultimately, I was working with 17 variables, and my dataset contained 1,048 rows. The first question in my analysis was to look at my sleep patterns over the last 3 years. I would say that it is pretty consistent, which I'm glad to see that things aren't changing too much. I'm not starting to sleep a lot less. But one of the big changes that right away I can pick out from this plot is the change from April 2021 to 2022. Now, this change occurred when I went from a working schedule to when I was finishing up university in April. So that was exam month versus a working month, and there was a really big discrepancy in lifestyle there. I performed a very similar analysis for my resting heart rate over the last 3 years, but for the sake of time and going through all the questions, I won't dive in too deeply. For analyzing the differences between each day of the week, I went and plotted the steps, total calories, resting heart rate, and sleep, respectively. My takeaway from this is that for Fridays and Saturdays, there's a lot more variation in the data than for every other day of the week that I'm seeing. The other conclusion that I was able to take away was that Mondays and Wednesdays seem to have the fewest number of outliers, and also they tend to have much narrower whiskers than some of the other days of the week as a whole when looking at all 4 of the different metrics. From this, I might be able to draw the conclusion that my Fridays and Saturdays are very comparable and my Mondays and Wednesdays are very comparable, but these 2 groups of days are the most dissimilar from one another. Moving on to the differences for me between weekends and weekdays, I looked at resting heart rate and sleep. In both cases, for resting heart rate and for sleep, the median of my weekend data falls quite close to either the 75th quartile or the 25th quartile of the box plot for the weekday data. And this would suggest that there is likely a statistical difference for resting heart rate and sleep when looking at the difference between weekend and weekdays. When I was analyzing the changes between when I was at university to when I was working or outside of school, one of the biggest things I noticed was the difference in my step counts. One of the metrics I use on my watch is a step count goal, where daily I have a goal of reaching 13,000 steps. Interestingly enough, I reached this step goal 50% of the time while I was at university compared to 26% of the time while I was away from university. And this is a good reminder to me that when the opportunity exists, to make sure I get out there and keep moving and walk around. One of the differences as well between being at university and being away is the ability to drive places here in Calgary versus at university, where I primarily walked. The last part of my data story was to see whether or not I could perform some predictions on my data. So I chose to make predictions on whether or not the day of the week was a weekend or whether or not I was attending university. And I did this through using a tool called Kneim, which is a free open source data analytics platform where you can do all kinds of data processing, analytics, and modeling through a pretty visual and easy to use interface. For predictive purposes, I chose to use a random forest machine learning algorithm. It can handle both classification and regression problems, but here I was just performing classification. One of the things that I was really interested in that Kneim allows you to see quite easily is which predictors are being used what percentage of the time when it's making predictions. So the first plot here, I can see that resting calories are being used the most to predict whether or not it's a weekend. And for university, resting calories again is being used the most, followed by the sleep I was getting during the week. This was a fairly interesting result for me because I didn't think of resting calories as being a metric that would be used in the predictive purposes, but in both cases here, it was used the most. Using the predictors, I was able to get an accuracy of 81% to say whether or not I was at university versus just 70% to say whether or not the day of the week was a weekend. To conclude, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who took the time to watch this walkthrough of my data story.